What's good, guys? I was just reading or starting to read this piece that I saw on xdadevelopers.com. It's called I Just Don't Care About the Steam Deck 2 Anymore. I was starting to read it and it raised some really interesting points. Some of them I think are really good points. I wanted to talk about it because I kind of have like similar feelings where I will care about the Steam Deck 2 when it releases, but I don't think I should care about the Steam Deck 2 right now, if that makes any sense. And I think I'm going to explain it as we go through this article. I haven't read through the whole article. I can already tell that there are parts that I definitely agree with and some parts that I definitely do not agree with. But I think it's a well-written piece and I think he raises some good points. The author here is Jacob Roach. And again, this is on xdadevelopers.com. I visit XDA developers relatively frequently. They have some interesting posts about like note-taking apps and like Docker containers that you should use and things like that. So like they are a pretty solid site, I would say. And I like the content that they've written in past. And so far, I'm liking this. I would say I kind of disagree with more in this piece than I agree with so far, but I like this piece and I think it's well worth discussing. So let's dig into it, right? I'm going to read it and I'm going to react to some of the parts that I think are most interesting. And Jacob starts by saying, I've been a staunch Steam Deck supporter since the day the handheld was announced. I was in the first wave of pre-orders. Me too, by the way. I picked up the Steam Deck OLED immediately, and even in the face of a dozen more powerful options from other brands, the Steam Deck remains the only handheld for me. I'm going to pause right there. So the fact that I get handhelds from companies gives me more of an opportunity to kind of replace my Steam Deck than I would otherwise have. Because if I wasn't like a YouTuber, I'd probably still just have the Steam Deck OLED. I wouldn't have anything else. That said, although that's true, I have had the chance to try an ROG Ally X and I really like it, right? I haven't really gone back. The ROG Ally X is, I would say, my favorite handheld so far, thanks to the power, thanks to the battery life. And then once I put Bazzite on it, it was really nice. Spoiler alert, I'm going to talk a lot about Bazzite in this video. All right, he continues. Jacob Roach continues. He says, but it's getting difficult for me to put my stock in whatever the successor to the Steam Deck is. Valve revolutionized the PC handheld market with the Steam Deck, but it's a company that is notoriously fickle with hardware releases. I'm going to pause again. Notoriously fickle with hardware releases. I'm with Jacob on this. I think Valve is notoriously fickle with hardware releases. That's not to say that they don't support their hardware over a long period of time, but we never saw a successor to the Steam Link. We still haven't seen a successor to the Steam controller. We still haven't seen a successor to the Valve Index. These are things that we've heard of being in the works. We've heard of a Steam Controller 2 in the works. Valve has worked with other controller manufacturers to create third-party Steam controllers. Index successor, the Valve Deckard, that is being worked on. But it's been years. And really for let's say the Deckard, right? We've been hearing about that for years, for at least 1 to 2 years, and still no announcement, right? That's not to say it's not coming. It's just to say you couldn't buy the Valve Index and then be like, oh, I can't wait for the next Valve headset. I mean, you could, you're just going to be waiting a very long time. And so I don't feel compelled to wait that long for a Steam Deck 2, but I think I'm getting ahead of myself. So Jacob continues to say, with more and more APUs designed for low power applications like handhelds, the broad release of SteamOS, and a growing list of competitors bringing their own secret sauce, I just don't care about the Steam Deck 2 anymore, regardless of what it would represent for the industry. So he raises a good point here, right? Like there's increasingly kind of less reason to care about the Steam Deck 2. I know a lot of people still are going to say it's the Steam Deck or bust, right? Like I'm not buying another PC handheld. I'm sticking to the Steam Deck until there's a Steam Deck 2. But I think obviously for a broad sector of people, although that may be true for some people, that's not necessarily true for everybody, right? There are plenty of people that are going to be enticed by an ROG Ally, ROG Ally X, Xbox Ally X, or whatever may come in between now and whenever the Steam Deck 2 is released. Anyway, he goes on to say, I didn't realize how far along SteamOS was for a general release until I got my hands on the Lenovo Legion Go S. This is the first handheld that officially supports SteamOS and arrived alongside the release of SteamOS 3.7, which added early support for other AMD-powered handhelds, basically everything short of the MSI Claw. Yeah, the MSI Claw gave itself the short end of the stick by going with Intel, which just is not necessarily great on. It's not bad on Linux, right? But clearly, the work that different teams have been doing for AMD drivers and things like that are just way ahead of the state that the Intel chips are on, that the MSI Claw is on. All right, Jacob keeps saying the experience of SteamOS on the Legion Go S is seamless. It feels no different from using the operating system on the Steam Deck. The jankiest thing about it is that the power profiles aren't capitalized in the quick access menu. I'll take that for an experience that's as clean as the Steam Deck. All right, here's where I'm going to chime in and talk about like Bazzite, right? Like, I've been using Bazzite on the ROG Ally X since I've had the ROG Ally X. And yeah, I think that experience is at least as clean as SteamOS on the Steam Deck. There is maybe a bit of jankiness. There is an application called HHD, stands for Handheld Daemon, and that application is perfect. It's not that the application is janky, it's that you sort of have like these two different modes where you're working with SteamOS menu to do some things, and then you're working with the HHD menu to do some other things. I think the HHD functionality is perfect and is probably better than what's available in SteamOS. But you could argue that it's a little bit janky to sort of have these two different user interfaces, right? But other than that, I would say the experience is super clean. All right, Jacob continues by saying it's less about where we are today and more about where we came from, however. In April, just a handful of weeks back, Valve launched a preview of SteamOS 3.7.0. Our very own Joe Rich Jones, that's a great name, flashed it on the ROG Ally X, and the experience was far from ideal. Broken controller support, strange button mappings, and a temperamental update process made it basically unusable. Valve has not only released SteamOS 3.7.0 onto the stable channel now, it's gone all the way up to 3.7.8, and each update has fixed issues and improved support for other handhelds. Valve is so confident now that it includes instructions on how to install SteamOS on other devices. I think that's really interesting too. There is a lot of work that Valve is doing with SteamOS 3.7 specifically about supporting other handhelds. Well, let me continue. He says, that's just the progress we've seen in the past few weeks. Flashback a year, and the idea of installing SteamOS on a non-Steam Deck handheld was a pipe dream. You'd have to use Bazzite, and before that, something like Chimera OS, to have a console-like experience on a Windows handheld. The Legion Go S opened the floodgates, and support for SteamOS on other handhelds will continue to improve at a rapid clip. If Valve's current pace is anything to go by, I suspect we'll look back in a few months' time and see a radically different form of SteamOS support on handhelds that otherwise use Windows 11. That's the sentence I think is interesting, right? He says, I suspect we'll look back in a few months' time and see a radically different form of SteamOS support on handhelds that otherwise use Windows 11. And this is once again where I go back to Bazzite, right? Like, it might be a little bit weird because I don't think of Bazzite as like a secondary form of SteamOS. I think of Bazzite as pretty much as good as, if not better than SteamOS. It's certainly more mature, right? So when we are maybe projecting what the future is for SteamOS, I feel like we can look at what the present is for Bazzite. If we look at what Bazzite is now, we can kind of see what SteamOS will be in the future. Bazzite has already been on this path of starting with a smaller scope of handhelds or devices that they support and expanding that over time, right? They've already been through what Valve is going through now. So Valve started effectively with the Steam Deck, but in terms of non-Valve hardware, they started with the Legion Go S. I think Bazzite started with the Lenovo Legion Go. That was kind of their big breakout device. And at that point, I had started to install Bazzite on the Legion Go. I didn't really, it was a little too early for me, right? So I didn't dig into it. It wasn't until, for me, the ROG Ally X was released that I really dug into it. And again, they went through sort of the same growing pains that Valve is going through now. Things didn't work on the ROG Ally X. They didn't have, the developers for Bazzite did not have an ROG Ally X to test on. I had the ROG Ally X ahead of release, right? So I was like, oh, I can install it. I can run whatever scripts they tell me to run, and I can report back like, hey, this isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't working. And then they can do all the hard work and be like, oh, Now that we have those logs, we have that telemetry, we'll fix it. We'll give you a new image. All right, try it now. Does it work now? And that is the cycle that I went through with the Bazzite developers, so that when the ROG Ally X launched, it was pretty much already compatible with Bazzite. So Valve now has to do the same thing, right? So I don't think it's going to be radically different in a few months' time, to be honest. I think it's going to be pretty much what Bazzite is now in a few months' time, at best, right? Like, and I don't mean that derisively. I think Bazzite as a standard is a great standard to look towards. All right, he continues, Valve makes some hardware, but it is and will always be a software company. I'm sure the Steam Deck 2 will be excellent once Valve decides it's time to take another swing at handheld hardware, but I don't see a world where the Steam Deck 2 can keep pace with the broader PC ecosystem. Brands like Lenovo, Asus, MSI, Ayaneo, and others will continue to push out new handhelds with the latest hardware and cutting-edge features. Valve won't. It has already proven it won't with the Steam Deck OLED and its impressive yet aging Zen 2 based APU. Okay, so this is one of the points that I highly disagree with. I think this writing is great. I think he's written a really great piece with some really well thought out points, but I do have to disagree that Valve just simply will not entertain cutting edge features, right? Like kind of the way he put it. It's not going to keep up with latest hardware, latest cutting edge features. I think that's not true. And using Steam Deck OLED to support that point is kind of a red herring, right? Because the Steam Deck OLED is like the Switch OLED. It's like the ROG Ally X, right? Compared to the ROG Ally. It is a refresh of a model. It's not the next model. So you can't look to that and say what Valve will do for their Steam Deck 2. You kind of have to look at the Steam Deck 1 to see what Valve will do for the Steam Deck 2. And if you look at the Steam Deck 1, it certainly was cutting edge. It certainly was competing with the latest hardware. There were and the fact that he references Ayaneo here as sort of a competitor is a little mind-blowing, right? Because it was Ayaneo and GPD were the only makers of PC handhelds. There have been all these prototypes up until this point, right? Like the Alienware, the Smock Z, all of these prototypes of potential PC handhelds, but the only ones that were actually doing it were GPD and Ayaneo until Valve released the Steam Deck OLED. So when the Steam Deck OLED was released, it certainly was competing with the latest it was ahead, well ahead of the latest hardware, well ahead of cutting edge features with Proton and things of the like, right? It was setting the standard. The Steam Deck was setting the standard. I guess you could argue it wasn't competing with the latest hardware if you look at consoles, if you look at like desktop graphics cards, but that feels like it would be insincere to compare it to those things when it's a handheld, right? So the author, Jacob, he continues, he says, Valve has made it clear that it won't make a Steam Deck 2 until it feels there's a significant enough upgrade in capabilities to justify a new handheld. You could argue that we've already reached that point. The APU inside the Steam Deck has held up well, but it uses a quad-core CPU based on an architecture that's 6 years old and a GPU architecture that's nearing 5 years old. There are several recent examples of games that either struggle or don't run on the Steam Deck due to this aging hardware. Doomed Dark Ages and Oblivion Remastered are prime examples of games with always-on ray tracing that struggle to run on a handheld that, despite RT-capable hardware, just isn't powerful enough. And make no mistake, the APU inside the Steam Deck wasn't cutting edge when the console was released. I'm going to get back to that. It was certainly capable, and it remains capable today for a wide swath of games, but Valve wasn't concerned about having the latest and greatest, even with the original Steam Deck, and it likely won't be for the Steam Deck 2. There are two reasons for that: cost and its semi-custom relationship with AMD. I'm going to continue because there's more to that, and I want to address all of this together. So he goes on, he says, cost is the most obvious point of contention. The Steam Deck, when it released, wasn't competing with the ROG Ally or the MSI Claw. It was competing with the Nintendo Switch, and to that end, Valve designed the handheld to reach a price of $400. I suspect most people spent $550 or more for a Steam Deck with more than 64 gigabytes of storage, but it's clear that hitting a $400 price base was important for Valve. It remains important. With the launch of the Steam Deck OLED, rather than ditch the original LCD model entirely, it moved the 256 gigabyte configuration of the LCD model down to the $400 base price. Okay, there's a lot to address there. between like compatibility of recent games like Doom: The Dark Ages, Oblivion Remastered. Also, the contention that the APU inside the Steam Deck wasn't cutting edge when the console was released. I think I know what he's getting at, but I don't agree. And hitting that base price of 400, right? Those are three really important parts. I'm going to start with the APU inside the Steam Deck. Insofar as like the RDNA generation, I forget what it was, but the RDNA generation inside that APU, no, it wasn't cutting edge because there was a more recent version of RDNA available or about to be available. My timelines are a little mixed up here, but it was not quite the generation you would have expected of RDNA, right? However, there was literally nothing like this, nothing like the Steam Deck in terms of power and battery life. Like it outperformed everything on both of those axes, right? So like even after Steam Deck was released, 6 months, 8 months, 10 months later, I forget exactly when the ROG Ally was released, even at that point, the Steam Deck was still beating the ROG Ally in one of those axes, which is battery life, right? The ROG Ally won in terms of peak power. The amount of power you can push through the ROG Ally was well above, like 10, 20%, depending on the game, well above what you could push with the Steam Deck. But the battery life in no way was competing with the Steam Deck on any like spectrum, right? And that's 10 months after the Steam Deck was released. So I can't agree that the Steam Deck wasn't cutting edge. I know what he means, at least I think I know what he means. But when it comes to like practical terms, what do you get out of this piece of hardware? The Steam Deck was cutting edge for what you get out of this piece of hardware. So I just can't agree with that point. Yeah, so moving on then to Steam Deck not being able to play games like Doom: The Dark Ages and Oblivion Remastered. To be honest, I don't know how these games play on like ROG Ally. I'm going to look that up real quick. I was a little bit under the impression that they weren't working great. ROGAllyLife.com says Doom: The Dark Ages is a very demanding game, lowering the resolution to 720p, 25/30 watt turbo mode with FSR at performance gives the smoothest experience with close to 40 plus FPS at an average, but it doesn't look great. Yeah, so I'm sure it wouldn't look great upscaling to 720p at performance. So pretty much it's not ultra performance, so it's not the lowest ratio you can do for FSR, but it's pretty low. So yeah, to his point, the point he's trying to make, right, is that the Steam Deck doesn't play the latest and greatest video games. So we think about Doom: The Dark Ages, we think about Oblivion Remastered as, like he said, prime examples of games that are not going to run well on the Steam Deck. And they're not going to run well on non-Steam Deck handhelds too, but at least they run better. We can say that. So yes, if what you care about is playing the latest and greatest games at the best fidelity possible, well, I mean, in that case, you're getting a new handheld every year because the best fidelity possible is a moving target, right? But certainly now, 2 years removed from the Steam Deck release and the Steam Deck OLED release, yeah, maybe you're ready for an upgrade. Okay. And then the last point I want to address there is the $400 base price point. I mean, Valve made it clear that was a big factor for them. They definitely did want to meet that $400 price point. What you receive for that $400 was unprecedented at the time. Now we have things that kind of sort of compete with that. But I don't know, even now, a handheld for $400, if you only have $400, you have to get the 256 gigabyte LCD, I think, right? Like maybe you go for a refurbished ROG Ally, maybe you go for a refurbished Lenovo Legion Go, or you wait for one of them to go on a deep discount. Sometimes they hit those discounts where it's like 400, 450. You could also do the same for like a Steam Deck. You wait for a discount. They have those refurbished ones that come out, and those are going to be under 400. So I think on any given day, if what you have is $400, I'm going to recommend a 256 gigabyte LCD. All right. He says that goalpost, the goalpost of $400, will likely move now that we have Nintendo Switch at a $450 MSRP. but price will remain important for the Steam Deck 2. Valve hardware designer Shreya Liu told IGN that the Steam Deck was designed with price in mind from the beginning, and Valve CEO Gabe Newell went as far as to say the price was painful but critical. Valve was also able to hit that price because it has a semi-custom chip from AMD. Valve's relationship with AMD is more similar to the relationship AMD maintains with Microsoft and Sony, not the relationship it has with brands like Asus and Lenovo. AMD designed a custom APU using established architecture specifically for Valve, just as it did for the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. Brands like Asus and Lenovo are using chips that AMD already makes elsewhere. The hardware isn't custom, some parameters are just tweaked to make that hardware more practical for a handheld. I'm sure the Steam Deck 2, whenever it arrives, will be impressive, but I highly doubt Valve will ditch the design philosophy and semi-custom relationship with AMD to make a handheld packing the same hardware and capabilities as the swath of options from brands like Lenovo, MSI, and Asus. It will likely compromise on hardware, poking around the design with AMD to reach a certain price point. And even if the next version of the Steam Deck is packing cutting-edge hardware at the time it releases, it'll almost certainly be outclassed by another handheld delivered from a brand that focuses solely on hardware shortly after. All right, so a bit to unpack there too, right? The thing I want to focus on there is that semi-custom relationship with AMD. The way the author, Jacob, kind of puts forth here, he kind of makes it seem like that relationship with AMD means compromise, and that's not how I see it. When I think about the relationship that AMD has with Microsoft, has with Sony, and the relationship that Nvidia has with Switch, what I see those companies getting, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, what I see them getting is a good bargain, right? It's not just that these things are tweaked, it's that these manufacturers or these companies are able to buy at a tremendous scale, a scale that is much bigger than that of Lenovo or Asus or MSI, right? It's the fact that they're able to buy at 50 million units plus over the lifetime of the device that gives them the ability to get a bargain, right? It's not that they're trying to pinch pennies here and pinch pennies there. It's that they're able to buy at scale and they're able to buy over a long period of time. And what that means is that over time, right, that console hardware is a static target, right? So it's going to go down relative to PC hardware that's refreshing every year. Everybody knows that. But when that hardware comes out, usually you're not able to reach that price point that Sony or Microsoft was able to reach if you were to buy off the shelf components, right? So if I want to match a PS5 Pro when a PS5 Pro is released, I'm going to spend more than what it costs to make a PS5 Pro, which that's pretty self-evident, right? As time goes on, I'll be able to build a PS5 Pro for cheaper than what the PS5 Pro costs. Again, this is pretty self-evident. This is pretty much like how consoles work versus how PCs work. Steam Deck seems like it's somewhere in the middle. I don't know how Lenovo entering the market, how Asus entering the market, I don't know how this alters the relationship that Valve has with AMD, but I don't think of the semi-custom relationship with AMD as a reason that we'll get lesser hardware to reach a lower price point. I think that we'll get the best bargain that we can for that low price point, which we still can't say for competitors like Lenovo and Asus, right? Lenovo and Asus are pushing the top end, but if I want to get bargain for my dollars, I think Steam Deck is still the best choice. All right, we're wrapping up here. He says, I may not care about the Steam Deck 2 from the standpoint of a consumer who is interested in buying handhelds, but I do care about what it represents for the growing industry. Valve set and maintains the standard for what a handheld gaming PC should look like. That's true not only in the usability and capabilities, but also support. Valve partners with iFixit to deliver OEM parts so users can repair their devices. It uses open source software and open sources its own so the community can expand the capabilities of SteamOS, and it's continued to put a downward pressure on prices. I agree. The Lenovo Legion Go seems expensive at $750, but that's only because the Steam Deck is so much cheaper. Prior to the Steam Deck, you would easily spend $1,200 or more on even a weak handheld gaming PC. So I think that sentence right there proves what I was saying earlier, which is counter to what Jacob was saying earlier, at least the way I read it, right? I think, yeah, Valve and the Steam Deck did set the standard and did give you cutting edge hardware at a cutting edge price with a cutting edge battery life, right? Yeah, you had to spend, when it was Ioneo and GPD, you had to spend $1,200 or more, and you didn't get something as good as the Steam Deck. He closes, he says Valve set the pace for the industry, and it would be disastrous to lose that market leader. When one company demonstrates what the entire industry should be capable of, that raises the bar for everyone. Suddenly, things like expandable storage with a micro SD card and a user upgradable SSD become the standard, and companies like Lenovo and Asus go beyond with their own features like dual USB-C ports, a larger battery, and a higher resolution display. The question for a device like the Legion Go S isn't if it's worth the money, it's whether the upgrade is worth enough compared to the Steam Deck. I agree. I hope Valve will continue leading the industry. At the end of the day, though, I highly doubt hardware was ever the end game. It's infinitely more lucrative for Valve to give away an operating system to other hardware vendors that's built specifically around a storefront where it takes 30% commission on every sale. I don't care how many Steam Decks Valve sells, Steam itself will always be its golden goose. So while I'm excited to see what Valve can do with the Steam Deck 2, I'm under no illusions that it will revolutionize the industry in the same way the original model did. The cat's out of the bag, and thankfully that means better handhelds for everyone. Again, that's the end of that piece. And again, I think it was a really good piece with some really good points. Of course, there are some things that I disagreed with, but that doesn't mean I don't think it was well written and well put forth. And to be honest, the reason this article is intriguing and compelling to me personally is because there are ways that I feel the same, right? Like, I don't feel like the title, right, is I just don't care about the Steam Deck 2 anymore. I do care about the Steam Deck 2, but I can't be pulled on a string, right? Like I can't just be waiting for a Steam Deck 2. If I want a more powerful handheld than the Steam Deck 1, then I'm just going to go out and get it. And I'm happy that there are companies like Lenovo, Asus, and Xbox now with the Xbox Ally X, who of course they're working with Asus. I'm happy that companies like these are jumping into the fray and not just offering competition, but really offering different selection, right? Because I like what Valve is going for with the Steam Deck and inevitably the Steam Deck 2. And I think they should continue going down that route. But at the same time, if I do want to play Doom to Dark Ages on my handheld, which I'm probably not going to play on the RG Ally, if I do want to play the latest and greatest on the handheld, then I'm probably not going to do it on the Steam Deck. Like I said, the RG Ally X is currently my favorite handheld to use. It has the power, but it still has, because of that 80 watt hour battery capacity, it has a battery life that competes with, if not does better than the Steam Deck. So finally, with the ROG Ally X, we have a device that at least competes with the Steam Deck on both axes. Both performance, it outclasses performance by far, and battery life, it at least kind of keeps up neck and neck with the Steam Deck. So yeah, I'm happy to have the ROG Ally X. I'm so happy that Asus jumped into this. I'm so happy that Lenovo jumped into this, and I can't wait to see more handhelds. So in that way, it's not that I don't care about the Steam Deck 2, but I can't be tied to just the Steam Deck brand. I don't mean this channel. Who cares, right? I mean me as a person, I can't just be looking for just the next Steam Deck. I look forward to any new PC handheld and seeing what it delivers. But obviously, I'm not everyone out there. I'm not everyone watching this video. I know a lot of you, for example, are just, I want those trackpads, and I care more about the Deckard than I do about, you know, the next handheld that's not a Steam Deck. I care more about the Deckard. I care more about a Steam box. I care more about Half-Life 3 because I care about Valve. Steam Controller 2 because I care about Valve. So where do you stand? What do you care about? Would you buy a Steam Deck? Would you buy a PC handheld that's not made by Valve? Let me know in the comments. Tech Gang out. Goodbye.